Creating a new car from scratch is an extremely long and costly process that can take more than a decade and involve investments of hundreds of millions. But if, in addition, the car in question has to be a high-performance precision machine, carefully designed to compete with its rivals, things get even more complicated. Let's not forget that many of the brands producing these types of cars are often small, boutique manufacturers, sometimes even crafting vehicles by hand. Unlike larger companies like Toyota or Volkswagen, they don't operate with massive budgets. As a result, brands like Pagani, Lamborghini, and Koenigsegg, among others, often need to find ways to cut costs on the most expensive components to develop, such as engines or headlights. Surprisingly, this sometimes means borrowing parts from more affordable, mainstream models to bring their extraordinary creations to life. In this video, we'll dive into cars you'd never expect to share the same engine, and others that borrowed parts in ways you won't believe. Let's start with the engines. Koenigsegg CC8S and Ford Crown Victoria. Koenigsegg, the Swedish automaker, is renowned for producing some of the world's fastest, most expensive, and technologically advanced hypercars. Given their incredibly low production volume each year, it's impressive that Koenigsegg now develops and manufactures most of their cars' critical systems and components in-house, avoiding reliance on external suppliers. However, this wasn't always the case. When the brand launched its first model, the Koenigsegg CC8S, they weren't yet fully independent. To power their early masterpiece, they turned to Ford, borrowing a V8 engine, the very same one found in the Crown Victoria. The Ford Crown Victoria, for those who don't know, is the classic sedan widely used across the United States as a police car or taxi. Police chases in 90s movies? Ford Crown Victoria. New York City taxis? Ford Crown Victoria. But how is it possible that a car worth $500,000 with only 6 units ever made could share the same engine as an old taxi? Here's where the difference lies. While it's technically the same engine, it's been heavily modified. The Crown Victoria's V8 is a 4.6-liter engine producing around 200 horsepower. Koenigsegg, however, completely reworked it. They reinforced the block, replaced the pistons, camshafts, and crankshaft, upgraded the cooling system, and added a supercharger, among many other enhancements. With all these modifications, the V8 underwent a complete transformation, delivering an incredible 655 horsepower. This allowed the Koenigsegg CC8S to surpass 390 kilometers per hour in top speed, kickstarting a lineage of engineering and design masterpieces that continues to thrive today. And to think it all began with the engine of a taxi, reworked in a small-town workshop in Sweden. BAC Mono and Ford Galaxy. The BAC Mono is one of those ultra-light sports cars designed for the track but fully road legal if you're willing to wear a helmet to shield your face from flying debris and endure a backbreaking ride on uneven roads. As the name suggests, the BAC Mono is a single-seater. You ride alone, but that's probably for the best, considering you'd have to sell all your friends and family to the Chinese mafia just to afford a toy that costs as much as a house. Of course, if anyone asks, the reason is weight reduction. After all, a passenger would only slow you down on the track, and that's simply unacceptable. In ultralight sports cars like this, the engine needs to be as compact and lightweight as possible, with power taking a back seat to overall weight reduction. For this reason, BAC chose the 2.3-liter 4-cylinder engine from the Ford Galaxy, one of the most common family minivans on the road, for the Mono. In the Galaxy, this engine produces 145 horsepower, which would already be impressive given the Mono's incredibly low weight of just 570 kilograms. However, the British team sent the engine to the legendary Cosworth, where it underwent a complete transformation. They added forged pistons and crankshafts, new camshafts, a dry sump system, a carbon fiber intake, and, of course, a completely redesigned exhaust system, among other upgrades. The result nearly doubled the engine's power to an impressive 284 horsepower. This meant that, with an engine borrowed from a Ford minivan, the Mono could deliver performance capable of outclassing almost any modern sports car, regardless of price or brand. Just take a look at the lap times on the Anglesey circuit. Notice who's sitting at the top. A Hot Wheels car powered by the engine from your mom's minivan. DeLorean DMC-12 and Renault Espace. The DeLorean DMC-12 needs no introduction. It's the iconic star of Back to the Future, and arguably the car with the greatest gap between how fast it looks and how slow it actually is. The DeLorean DMC-12 looks like an absolute beast with its stunning design and iconic gull-wing doors. However, as we mentioned in the video about slow cars that look fast, even a Fiat 500 could beat it in a quarter-mile race. Not so impressive for a car that looks looks straight out of a sci-fi fantasy. The problem lay in its very basic PRV V6 engine, which produced just 132 horsepower. This underwhelming performance was one of the key factors behind the DeLorean's commercial failure. And yes, as much as it pains us, the DeLorean was a massive flop for the company. By the time it gained fame thanks to Back to the Future, production had already ceased for several years. That PRV V6 was a shared engine developed by Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo, and it found its way into various models, including the Renault Espace. In the Espace, the engine was tuned to deliver a slightly higher output of 150 horsepower. In other words, the DeLorean's legendary engine had a more powerful version sitting in a family minivan. Sometimes reality is truly unpredictable. But wait, the Renault Espace has another wild connection to sports cars. For the Espace R4, Renault leveraged its partnership with Nissan to equip the family minivan with the famous VQ35 engine from the Nissan 350Z. Of course, the engine's power was toned down to around 240 horsepower. It didn't sell in large numbers, but it's still a fascinating piece of trivia. Pagani Zonda and Mercedes Zero's S-Class. In the 1990s, owners of the top-tier Mercedes S-Class enjoyed not only a luxurious and impeccably built vehicle, but also one of the finest engines Mercedes ever produced, the legendary M120. This naturally aspirated V12 initially delivered around 400 horsepower and was a masterpiece of engineering. Meanwhile, in Italy, an Argentine visionary named Horacio Pagani was searching for the perfect engine for a prototype he was developing, called the Fangio F1, named, of course, in honor of the legendary Formula One driver from his homeland. Pagani needed an engine that was powerful, refined, and unique. In 1994, Mercedes-Benz agreed to supply him with the M120. Just 1 year later, Juan Manuel Fangio passed away, and as a tribute to his memory, Pagani decided to rename his creation to Zonda, inspired by a strong and warm Argentine wind. This is how the Pagani Zonda C12 was born, the first model of the now iconic manufacturer, featuring the magnificent M120 naturally aspirated V12 engine mounted in a central position. In the following years, Mercedes developed larger and more powerful versions of the M120, some exceeding 7 liters in displacement and producing over 800 horsepower. These iterations found their way into high-performance versions of the S-Class, competition cars, and, of course, every variant of the Zonda. Models like the Zonda F, Zonda Cinque, and Zonda R all feature different versions of the M120, a masterpiece originally crafted for an old luxury sedan that remains a benchmark in automotive engineering to this day. Noble M600 and Volvo XC90. Today's Volvo XC90 is a hybrid SUV like many others. Its most powerful version combines a 145 horsepower electric motor with a 317 horsepower gasoline engine, a respectable output for a 2.0 liter 4-cylinder engine. However, not many people know that the most powerful version of the XC90 from 20 years ago delivered 300 horsepower, and back then it wasn't powered by a 4-cylinder, but rather a massive 4.4 liter V8. This V8 came with some fascinating design challenges. First, the XC90's engine bay wasn't large enough to accommodate such a big engine, particularly because the XC90 was designed to use transversely mounted engines rather than the longitudinal layout typically used for V8s. To overcome this, Volvo turned to Yamaha, who developed a remarkably compact V8 by reducing the cylinder angle to 60 degrees instead of the typical 90 degrees. This made the engine narrower and allowed it to fit in the XC90's engine bay. The second fascinating detail is that this compact V8 caught the attention of Noble, a small British manufacturer of handcrafted supercars based in Leicestershire. Noble decided to use the Volvo Yamaha V8 in their M600, but instead of mounting it transversely, they placed it in a longitudinal rear-mid configuration. Of course, since the 315 horsepower from the Yamaha Volvo engine wasn't quite enough for the performance they were aiming for, they added 2 massive turbos and a new fuel injection system, pushing the power up to an impressive 650 horsepower. The M600 is one of those underrated cars that hardly anyone knows, but when you take the time to really look, you realize it's a true gem. Handcrafted construction, stunning design, lightweight, a manual gearbox, and a V8 engine straight from a Swedish SUV. These are just a few examples of cars that surprisingly share engines, and there are many other interesting ones, but I'll save those for a second part if you enjoy this video. Now let's move on to some different examples. It's not just engines that are shared to reduce costs. Many high-end cars also use parts borrowed from more humble, everyday models. I'll show you a picture of 2 cars. See if you can spot what they share. Let's start with an easy one, the Lamborghini Diablo and the Nissan 300ZX. One costs $25,000, the other $250,000, but both share the exact same headlights. Instead of spending money to develop custom headlights, Lamborghini simply bought the ones from the Nissan 300ZX and installed them directly on the Diablo. In this video, you can clearly spot the headlights of the Diablo, complete with the small Nissan logo embedded in them. So yes, every Lamborghini Diablo has a hidden Nissan logo in its headlights. Other surprising cars that share headlights include the Morgan Aeromax and the Lancia Thesis, the Aston Martin DB7 and the Mazda 323, or the Jaguar XJ220 and the Rover 416. It's hard to believe, but this is actually fairly common and not just an isolated incident. The Koenigsegg CCXR, for example, uses rear lights from the Mazda RX-7 and the McLaren F1. Arguably one of the most advanced and exquisite pieces of engineering from its time, shares the same taillights as many buses. Have you noticed that many other supercars also have this type of circular taillights? For instance, the Pagani Zonda, the Saleen S7, or once again, the Lamborghini Diablo. These are cheap lights that you'll typically find on agricultural machinery. In fact, the taillights from some of the most expensive, fastest, and legendary cars in history can also be found on a tractor in your town. And believe it or not, for less than $40, you could buy a full set of these lights if you're keen on having the same taillights as a Pagani or Lamborghini. But headlights aren't the only thing some cars share. There are other, less obvious components that are shared too. For example, do you know what the Jaguar XJ220 and the Citroën CX have in common? The rear view mirrors. And what about the Lotus Esprit and the Morris Marina? This one's a bit harder to spot, but take a look at the door pull handles. They're the same. Now, the Pagani Zonda and the Rover 45 might seem worlds apart, but if you look inside, you'll notice they share the same air conditioning controls. Incredible, but true. Similarly, the Ferrari California and the Chrysler 300C also share the same screen and control system. It's tough to spot, but just look at how identical they are. There are plenty more examples, and some cars are true Frankensteins, but I'll save those for a second part. Let me know which one surprised you the most, and if you were already aware of these shared components. And if you want a second part, drop a comment below. That's all for now. Take care, have fun, and see you in the next one.